So my name is Ryan Brown. I'm an advisor in the UBC Community Engagement Office. Among other things at UBC, one of the pieces of work that I've been deeply involved in over the last 18 months is learning a lot about UBC's financial system. I kind of came in a bit green. I didn't know much about the UBC financial system. And so I spent a very long time learning about all of its nooks and crannies. And through that work, I've created a simple tool to help folks like yourselves navigate what is a complex and sometimes mystifying process for paying your community partners, your contributors, volunteers, participants, etc. I'm also joined by Sam Filipenko from the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, and I'll invite him to introduce himself now.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Yeah, my name is Sam. I use he, him pronouns. I am a non-Indigenous person of white settler ancestry, born and raised here on unceded and occupied Musqueam territory, where I'm joining you from the sunny URSI office at the Indigenous Research Support Initiative. I am the research program manager. I support collaborative research practices between the university and Indigenous community partners. And a lot of researchers come to me with questions about providing culturally appropriate financial gifts and honoraria. And so I support many folks on the university campuses to provide culturally appropriate financial gifts and honorarias by walking them through the Indigenous finance guidelines, which lays out a number of steps for people to follow. So I think about honoraria to community partners a lot. And I'm super happy to see all of the enthusiasm for this topic because it's one that I know is troubles many people on campus.
Thanks, Sam. And like Sam, I'm also non-Indigenous white settler. I use he, him pronouns. And I want to acknowledge also that I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I myself am originally from the territories of the Chippewas of Stony Point on the shores of Lake Huron, which is traditionally known as Carignondi. And as I prepared for today's session and thought about acknowledging the land that I'm on and the land that I live on, and in my conversations with Sam about the structure for today's conversation, I took some time to reflect on what this acknowledgement really means in the context of using large institutional financial systems while trying to advance reconciliation and decolonization at UBC. So throughout today's conversation, you'll notice that we talk a lot about being advocates or boundary spanners or connectors. And what we're really getting at with this language is that we all carry a responsibility to be good, equitable partners. And this is really a key to advancing reconciliation and decolonization. So in the very specific context of making financial payments and all of the issues that that raises for us in our personal and professional lives, we have an opportunity to engage with this responsibility in our everyday practices, particularly when we work with Indigenous partners, communities, and organizations, but also in the wider context as we work with those who are not inside the system and who have very little control or influence over it or experience with it. In the act of being a good partner to those outside of our institution, we take on whatever work we can as advocates for our partners. It's a deeply important and singular act that we can take on and has massive implications for how our partners are able to work with us and what forms of access, respect, and acknowledgement they feel they receive. So I'm really happy that you've joined us today, and I hope the information that we share and the conversation we're able to have helps you feel emboldened to be a good partner. That will be our next slide. Oh, there we go. My system is slow, I apologize. Today, we want to share accessible information and guidance on compensating community partners, and we'll also reference other helpful resources, such as the Indigenous Finance Guidelines, which is, again, under Sam's purview in URSI, and the how-to guide that I've led the work on for the Community Engagement Office, as well as resources out of the UBC finance teams. And in terms of compensation, we just want to highlight there are essentially two different kinds. There's a fee for service, and there's tokens of appreciation, or what we'll describe as honoraria payments for today's purposes. And we'll be focused on these honoraria payments. It doesn't mean that the others aren't something you should consider, but this is just the focus of today's presentation. And so when we talk about honoraria payments, what are we really talking about? We're talking about small payments. So these are less than $500. They're really intended to be one-time payments to individuals. And they're a form of appreciation or gratitude for their participation in or contribution to the work of UBC faculty, staff, and or students. So they're not required payments. They're just a voluntary payment to express your gratitude. In addition to these payments to individuals, there are also payments to organizations, and these can be much, much larger. There are resources for these kinds of payments, and you should engage with your finance team to learn more about navigating these situations. But just for today's purposes, we're talking about payments to individuals. So for today's conversation, we have three general goals that we want to meet. First, we want to just clarify how honorary payments fit into the UBC system and dispel some common myths that we've heard over the years. We want to share some best practices for making the system work for honorary payments. And then we want to highlight some common problems and potential solutions that we've learned over the years as we head through, as well as what we heard through the pre-event survey. So we want to bring that back into today's conversation. So before we dive into how UBC's financial system works, no minor task, we first want to ground the conversation in some core values of community engagement. So this will really shape how we approach offering and managing honorary payments. And this is really where we start to situate ourselves in those concepts of advocacy and connection and boundary spanning. So there's 5 principles that I want to reflect on here. Each one builds on the others before it. So the first is relationality and connectedness. So relationships are really central to community work. They help us understand and collaborate as partners, and particularly as UBC administrators who are engaged with communities. You're really balancing 2 relationships. You have the relationship to your community partner, but you are also building a relationship with your colleagues at UBC, and this includes finance and human resources. And it's important to maintain strong connections in both and understand that they take different types of relationship building practices to keep them going. Part of this is through reciprocity and resource sharing. So relationships and partnerships, they rely on mutual support and sharing resources to meet shared goals. Community partners are sharing their time, their expertise, their perspective, and what they actually represent, all of which really makes our partnered work possible. And our honoraria payments, in addition to public acknowledgements of their contributions, finding ways to work together that really respect and honor the time that they're giving us, those payments really reflect a commitment to reciprocity and resource sharing. So they're very important symbolically. And in order to do this type of resource sharing right, we need to acknowledge power imbalances between UBC and our community partners, as well as the ongoing and lingering effects of inequity and colonialism on the relationships that we have. So being mindful of power dynamics is really going to help us ensure that there's fairness, equity, and decolonization knit throughout how we relate to one another. And being fair and equitable means recognizing that partners access university resources differently. So financial systems may be rigid, and we're going to highlight that a lot today, but you can bring flexibility into the process by sharing information clearly with your partners, by adapting your own processes to their needs. So your role starts to become one of ensuring that the process works for them within the system's constraints. And then lastly, but certainly not least important, it kind of ties all of these other 4 together, is transparency. So being open with your partners, this helps build trust and foster collaboration, and not going so far as to be transparent all the time and overwhelming your partners with every piece of information that you have at your disposal. It's about being aware of what you need to give to your partner, when you need it to give it to them, and with the overall strategy of trying to make the process as smooth and transparent as possible.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan, for laying out those key core values. I think community engaged work is about values. It is such values driven work. So I think that situating ourselves in the context of community engagement is in those values is super important. Um, and I want to start everyone off with a little bit of reassurance that you do not need to bend the rules or find workarounds in order to make honoraria payments happen. But, you do need to learn how to speak the language of the university as well as the language of community engagement in order to make that payment process run smoothly. You need to be a bridge and a connector between these 2 worlds. You need to be an advocate for your community partners' needs somebody who has insider information and knowledge to make the system work for your partnerships. And it's the discrepancies between the ways that the university needs things to be done and the way that your community partner needs things to be done that can make it feel like workaround tricks or, even outright deception are the only ways to make payments happen. As a connector, it's important to make sense of these university processes for your community partner, to take the time to share information and to answer questions. And simultaneously, it's important to be responsible to what UBC needs from you as a faculty member, staff, or student of the institution. And all of this reassurance and encouragement aside, none of this is to say that there aren't very real structural barriers within the system. And sometimes these can make providing honorary payments in certain situations difficult. We've heard through the pre-event survey about some of these situations, and I'm happy to touch on them later. But I want to say that usually solutions can be found. So I want to start out by debunking a common misunderstanding that the UBC financial system is not set up to pay community partners, and that in order to provide an honoraria, it's just a giant system of workarounds. And while we understand that it may feel this way, please again be reassured that honoraria payments are a completely acceptable form of payment within the UBC financial system. So, why do so many of us feel like this sweet dog sitting in a fiery room, suggesting to themselves that everything is fine? Like Ryan alluded to, the UBC system, although has a massive capacity to deliver payments, is highly rigid. It has structured requirements that must be followed, and all of which are organized around a set of very specific instructions. And to be honest, very few of these instructions are translated or configured for community-based needs. For example, people receiving payments from the university are considered a supplier in Workday, even if they're not supplying anything. An elder is not supplying a opening ceremony or a land acknowledgement for your event, but they would be labeled as a supplier in the system. Um, this rigidity is an indication that the system is very focused on compliance. UBC has financial obligations to the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, funders, and others that they do take very, very seriously. And so even though we may see honoraria as tokens of appreciation or gifts, UBC also sees them as perhaps taxable income. And the CRA may perhaps see them as taxable income. So there's that lack of translation for community-based needs. The second problem is that despite there being many payment options available through the system, lots of faculty and staff do not understand the full range of options that are available to them. And so many people continue to use the same methods even when more appropriate or even sometimes easier payment options are available to them. This lack of knowledge adds to those feelings of rigidity. However, this is not just, a you problem. I also have to admit that, while Workday is a fairly incredible tool of ability, it can very quickly feel daunting. It's designed to do a lot, and so it can seem endless and impossible to plod through, especially when you're just used to using it to, check your pay stub or request a little vacation time. Um, again, I want to be reassuring that even though there may not be perfect solutions to every problem, there are people at UBC who you can speak with about what potential options are available to you and find a solution that works within the system. So, people like me for Indigenous related finance questions, or perhaps your faculty or units, HR, or finance administrative team. And so, while I could lament about Workday for probably the entire portion of this workshop, and commiserating on what feels wrong with the system is a great way to connect over shared frustrations. We definitely want to spend our time today on a more productive angle, and how do we make use of the system that's available to us. So, you know, Importantly, we do always have to remember that UBC is bureaucratic, it is risk averse, and they take compliance and their financial obligations very seriously. And so, in order for honorary payments to go as smooth as possible, we need to adapt ourselves to this institutional context. We need to be prepared in advance because these things can take time. We need to be process oriented, so we're meeting the steps that are required from UBC. And we need to be strategic in how we work so we can play that connector role, make things smooth, and be good community partners. We need to do good by our community partners. So this means, getting to know the systems that we use, playing around in Workday, reviewing resources and training, asking questions whenever we're lost or confused, reflect on these learnings as they're ongoing and to systematize our own process because throughout all this, you will become an expert in what works for you and your community partners. And last but certainly not least, focus on developing supportive relationships with UBC colleagues, administrators, etc., to help out along the way. And relationships take time to build, as I'm sure everybody here who's involved in community engaged work knows. So give yourself enough time, enough runway to take all these proactive steps. Remember, you are the boundary spanner for your community partner. You're their access point to the university, and you need to become the overlap in the Venn diagram in order to meet the requirements of UBC's institutional systems, but still keeping your partner's needs at front of mind. Your goal is to manage things on the back end, that it's completed properly in accordance with the rules that govern UBC's financial systems, while translating those requirements into your community partners' language that they, and actions that are appropriate and make sense to them. That's the work you have to do to be a good partner. And, that's speaking to Ryan's values. That's what it means to be equitable. Ryan, you're mute.
Mute. Sorry about that. I just wanted to flag too at that point, thinking about translating for your community partners, there are resources that are available, and some are very new, and some have been around for a few years, like the Indigenous Finance Guidelines, the Community Engagement Office guidelines, which are really just being released now that you wouldn't be familiar with them. These are our first attempt at translating what's it tends to be really inaccessible language for a lot of people when it's in the sort of finance discourse. So we're creating tools that can help you along the way. So it's not just connecting with people, but there's also some online resources that you can use to help you along the way. At this point, we want to start to switch and start talking about specific ways that you can use the financial system. But before we do that, just one last thing. There's some important things you want to know before you even start processing a payment. These are just sort of like really quick 5 things to know before, like as I start thinking about an honorary payment. So the first is know where your community partner is located and their relationship to UBC. So are they in Canada or elsewhere? Are they located on reserve? Are they currently a UBC faculty, staff, or student member? Or were they previously, or have they never been affiliated with UBC? This will all have a massive impact on what methods of payment are available to you and what you need to do to process a payment, as well as how much time it will take. The second thing is understand the context of your payment. Talk with your community partner or others in their sector or their community or their field, whatever it might be, to try to understand what's typical in terms of the standards of processes that they may be accustomed to. And while you may not be able to fit perfectly into these expectations, knowing about them, showing some respect for them, and opening conversations about them will start to build that trust. And then you and your partner will be on the same page in terms of what's possible. And to help you in these conversations, take some time to review the different methods of payment, which we'll get to into the next slide. They each have different timelines for processing payments. They may require different kinds of information. And like in the case of setting up an EFT, which I'm sure many of you are somewhat familiar with or very familiar with, there's an additional step involved to set up the partner in the system before you even try to process a payment. So the more familiar you are with these at the outset, the better you will be able to understand what the options you may have available to you in your particular scenario. And then you can more clearly communicate that with your partners and your colleagues to work out whatever solution makes the most sense to everybody. And to this end, take some time to just play around in Workday when you're not processing a payment. Familiarize yourself with that system. Take some training or review the resources that you have available to you. Um, if you understand how it works, as well as how maybe your department or your unit or your faculty or portfolio navigates it, this will help train you in a way that is so helpful in the future. And I can say from personal experience, having started my journey with very little knowledge about how Workday actually worked, just going into Workday and doing some mock runs through it taught me so much more than sitting and reading through an instructional guide, or even having the instructional guide on one screen and working through Workday and just trying it out and seeing what happens. Sometimes you can find your own little quick steps that way. It's really helpful. So just having a bit of like a sandbox play with Workday, despite how boring that may sound, it actually is very helpful and can even be a little bit fun if you're that type of person. Um, and so what this really ties into across the board is information is key in this process. And in particular, when we're talking about community engagement, speaking early with partners to talk about what their options are and what each requires will help you get buy-in and avoid unnecessary delays later on. Or if you do have delays, they're not surprises to anybody. You can talk about why that delay happened and everybody can be on the same page. The real risk to partnerships in terms of delays is if you can't avoid a delay, in the very least, you can have some common understanding about why that delay happened and what to do, and that can alleviate a lot of frustration. And I just want to point to a key additional consideration here. There are situations where it is culturally inappropriate to collect a piece of information or to reach out to a particular community member, etc. There's many scenarios where it is culturally inappropriate to do some part of the process. It's okay. These situations arise, and part of the role of being this connector, this advocate, this boundary spanner is recognizing that you're going to face some struggles. It's not your fault. And the best thing you can do is really have a plan for what to do in those scenarios, and what you and how to proceed. And a really good way to do this is to have conversations with your unit head or your finance representative or your HR representative, maybe a trusted partner or colleague, someone who you can speak to about what scenario you may be in, and try to figure out some solutions together. It just helps to alleviate a lot of that strain and feeling like we're all alone trying to figure out a problem. You have a lot of people around you who can help you, and especially if you can do that ahead of time, it makes it even better. We'll shift to the next slide there. So now we're going to get into some tables of current methods of payment for individuals. So with all that in mind, we just want to go through what methods of payment are out there, and what each requires in terms of the information you need, who you can offer it to, and all those things. So you can see from these tables, there are a number of payment methods available, and they're all dependent on the kind of relationship the individual who will receive the payment has or has had with UBC. So for current UBC employees, you're pretty limited in what you can offer, either one-time payments or near cash equivalents. Basically, you're using the UBC payroll system to pay that person. You're also required to use something called the Employee Declaration for Services form, which many of you may be familiar with, as well as the HR Fast Track form. When you switch to someone who's affiliated with UBC, but only in the last 24 months and not currently, you get some different options. You have electronic funds transfer, check, and near cash equivalent. But you no longer have access to that one-time payment option. And when we switch to people who have no affiliation with UBC, or at least have not been affiliated with UBC in the last 24 months, you have the most options for making a payment. You can use that EFT or check, and these are still the preferred methods of payment at UBC. And a new option I want to highlight for you, which also uses EFT or check, is called single-use payment, and I'll share a little bit more on the next slide on this one, but it's a new process that's been in place since February of this year. And if it's not appropriate or possible to make a payment by EFT or check, and your reasons for this need to be clearly documented and communicated in your process in Workday, you can use cash or near cash equivalents for individuals who are not affiliated with UBC. So many may be surprised to hear that. They don't know about these options, and we'll talk about those a little bit on the next slide. But yeah, just wanted to highlight that that is available, but there does need to be a clear rationale for why you're doing that. And I just want to make a quick note too. You'll see cultural advising and honoraria forms on these tables. These are helpful tools, but they're not required for use. They're just a helpful way to make sure you are collecting all the information you need in order to process a payment and can be added to any Workday request as documentation. And for SINs in particular, they're a very useful way for documenting that you've requested a SIN. There's a section on there where it'll say, are you comfortable providing your SIN? So it gives the community partner the space to say yes or no to that question. And gives you the documentation you need in the event that collecting the information is either impossible or inappropriate. We just go to the next slide now. I just want to make some key points on these methods of payment. So one-time and single-use payments, again, the single-use payment is very new. These may be kind of game changers for many of you. For many, these options are pretty unfamiliar, and in particular single-use, as it has only been available since February. They're both designed to be very quick compared to other methods. They require less information, and the process is much faster in Workday. But you need to remember a few things about them. One is they're limited to payments of up to $250. They both use EFT or check as a form of payment, so they both require collecting either a mailing address or banking information. And for single-use payment in particular, the recipient cannot be set up as a supplier in Workday. So if you are going in this thinking, I'm going to use this single-use payment, you go into Workday and find that they're set up as a supplier, the option, unfortunately, is no longer available. For EFT and check payments, a few things to note about these is, one is that they are the preferred methods of payment at UBC and should be used in most cases. And remember, EFT, if it is not already set up in Workday, this takes additional time, and it also takes the partner that you are going to pay through EFT to go to the bank. So these are a couple of things just to recognize that those can take a significant amount of time. So it pays to get those done earlier in your process. So what you can do on your end in terms of being set up strategically is, I know I'm going to pay a partner. Maybe the first thing you do is quickly go into Workday. You see if they're a supplier, you see if they're set up with EFT, and then that tells you if they want EFT, then you have that piece of work to do up front, and you can get that done earlier, as opposed to waiting until that payment process is happening and then you find out. And of course, there may be reasons why EFT and check are not appropriate or possible. Perhaps an alternative form of payment like cash or near cash would be applicable in your partner circumstances. It's all right to consider these as options for non-affiliated individuals again. But remember that when you use these payment methods, you need to start to develop a clear rationale for why you're using those payments. So start to document information on your end about why that choice is being made. And wherever possible, you should be trying to use those UBC systems like Workday invoicing, supplier invoice requests, or just a regular invoice. And cash should be used in limited circumstances. And the reason for this is that the reporting requirements don't change when you're using cash or near cash equivalent. You still have the same reporting requirements to UBC Finance, with the except that when you're using EFT and check, all of those prompts for that information are automated. So you have in Workday a place to put in a SIN, all that personal information. When you're paying cash, you don't have those systems in place. So you become responsible for collecting that information. So it's just something that you need to be extra mindful of as you go through that process. And again, I want to point back to those honoraria forms and cultural advising forms as a really helpful tool for collecting that type of information and making sure that you're doing it in compliance with what UBC Finance requires. And just as a last note on these, regardless of which one you're using, in whatever scenario you are in, remember to familiarize yourself with the processes that you will engage with, and just follow the instructions and whatever resources are available to you. Again, those could be the resources that ERC provides or community engagement provides, or maybe it's within your department. Just make sure that you know what's coming next and that you're prepared to provide whatever information you need to at that point.
Okay. So, that's a lot of information there. And, I encourage people to maybe review it on your own time. Sometimes I know that when I see tables of information, my brain just like goes like, and I like, so, I think that's why we say that, take some time to review these things on your own. But all that leads us to say is, what are our best practices for UBC's financial system to make it work for you and your partners? In summary, like we've been discussing, recognize what relationships you need to build and rely on. Ones with your community partners, ones with finance and HR on the UBC side, and know what each of your relationships, both internally and externally, needs in order to be sustained and nourished and fulfilled in order to move these processes forward. Understand the systems that UBC uses, which means you should have familiarity with Workday, the administrative forms that Ryan was talking about, HR fast track forms, employee declaration of services forms, perhaps if you're using them, honoraria and cultural advising forms, as well as institutional timelines. So how long do each of these things take to gain the necessary approvals to release the funds, whether that's EFT, check, cash, or near cash equivalents. Understand those payment options that are available to you, when they're applicable and appropriate, and how to properly process them. And again, please don't forget that you can access further trainings through finance, through the Workplace Learning Center, WPL, through the Community Engagement website or the ERSI office. There's lots of places for you to find access to resource and help to know what's available. And lastly, in culmination of those two things, know how to articulate a clear rationale for your decisions so that way everyone knows why you're doing what you're doing. This can look like knowing what information UBC Finance needs to know in order to process a payment, or it can look like knowing what information your community partner needs to know about the system that you're working with. Knowing how to provide a clear rationale to both parties is important. This way everybody stays in the loop and the payment process works for both UBC and, more importantly, for your community partners. So, we're just going to get into the barriers and challenges that we heard from everyone who filled out the pre-workshop survey. Ryan, I'm noting that there's a few things going into the chat right now. Do you think we should take a quick second? Katie, did you want to let us know before we get into these barriers and challenges that we heard, if there's some pressing questions from, the information that we just provided everybody?
Yes, there are 3 questions that would benefit from an answer now. The first is about what a near cash equivalent is. Sherry asks, can you give an example of a near cash equivalent, please?
Yeah, the simplest example of a near cash equivalent is a gift card or a voucher of some kind. Anything that can be used as cash, but is not in itself cash, basically. All other forms of payment that would be like, buying something for someone as a gift would not be a near cash equivalent.
Like, let's say you're buying someone art or something.
Go ahead, Sherry, if you've got a follow-up.
Thank you. So just to clarify, if we give a gift certificate or whatnot, excuse me, do we not have to track that for year-end purposes for taxes?
You do have to track that. So that's when I was, I can't remember what slide it was a few slides ago, saying when you're using cash or near cash, the automated prompt for tracking information that's required for reporting goes away. So you are responsible for tracking all of the information. It's all still required. The reporting requirements don't change depending on what method of payment you use. You just have the way that you collect the information does. So you just have to be a little bit more thoughtful about the process you use, so that when you're using cash, you're still collecting all that information and then documenting it in Workday, because you won't have those fields that you're filling out in Workday. It'll just be you providing information that you've collected.
Okay, thank you.
Great. The next question from Bernadette asks if there's a preferred option for non-Canadian or international partners.
For non-Canadian, it depends. There's a very special relationship with the US. So you would use for EFT, you use something called the Automated Clearinghouse, ACH, and you can find that resource just by searching for Automated Clearinghouse UBC. It'll come up. I can also share it in the chat once I get a chance. And then for international payments, it's a bit more complicated. And then you can also use checks. So you could just get a mailing address and then mail the check. We've had an experience in the community engagement office of sending checks and then they just kind of go missing. So using courier service is a really good way to avoid delays. And just working with finance to get that done. So they may provide the check to you to courier, or they may courier, but just have that conversation and say, we want to make sure that we can track this payment so that we know exactly how long it's going to take to get there. For international payments, there is the name is
the Global Distribution System.
That's
GDS.
The one. The reason I couldn't remember it is because it is hard to remember that. It is a very complicated looking book that you go through. It's a PDF, and it provides you with the banking information for each country so that you can do wire transfer through that banking system. Each country has its own banking rules, so each one has its own set of guidelines to follow. So you just have to access that resource and then go that way. And again, I would work with folks who know, so you work with people in your finance team who have done these types of payments before. And I know there's people who do global payments quite often at UBC, and you can connect with them and they'll be able to provide you with lots of helpful guidance and places that you might get stuck that they're aware of now because they've done it so much.
Definitely.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I'll just add on one more thing about providing international payments. Once it, international to non-US destinations, I'll specify that. I'd have to double check about the US payments, but if you're providing to international partners, you do need to have them have a bank account and bank accounting information to set them up in the global distribution system to provide that wire transfer. There are also options to I've spoken about sometimes with people who have taken out cash if their international partners don't have bank accounts for whatever reason, that you can still request cash. But of course, if you are traveling with cash, there are necessary precautions that, and risk associated with that UBC would encourage to not be taken on for any one individual. So the global distribution system is the preferred method for international payments. You aren't need to collect any SIN numbers or other information other than the bank account information, because once the money leaves Canada, it's no longer sort of like the CRA is less concerned about its tax implications because then the money is being earned somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
No problem.
And I just wanted to add one more detail in terms of using cash payments. There's for those who are unaware, there's a process called spend authorization, which would be typically the way that you would make a cash payment. So you would work with your unit head and finance rep to have a spend authorization approved. The rationale and purpose of that payment would be clarified in that process. The funds would be transferred to the account that's set up to offer that cash payment. And then that cash can be removed from the account, given to the person. Documentation then can be done at the time when you make that transfer, call it, when you're providing that honoraria payment. And then either you can have the person who's receiving the payment sign off and say, hey, I've received this payment, and the documentation would be there if you use that honoraria form. Or you can have a witness from who was at the event and saw the payment happen, and that can be provided as your documentation. And then you would close your spend authorization that way back in Workday. So there are instructions in that guide that I provided a link to in the chat for spend authorization. I really don't want to go through that in this context because it's a very long and dry instructional, but you can find very detailed instructions in those guides.
Great. We've got 3 more questions. The first has been kindly already answered in the chat by Ludmila. Thank you very much. I'll just repeat the question in case there's any details to add from Sam and Ryan. Tio asks, does one time mean one time per person? So if it is used once for one individual, do they need to be set up as a supplier for any future instances? And then you can see a response from Ludmila confirming, yes, it's 250 once per person per lifetime. And then Tio makes a great remark in response. So over to you for any clarifying or additional information, Sam and Ryan.
Sam, I don't know if you have thoughts first.
I'll let you jump in first.
I agree, Tio. That is very hard in terms of developing longitudinal relationships with community partners. And again, like we were saying at the beginning of this process, you've got a rigid institutional system that's focused on compliance, and then that relationship building is really the role that we play as engaged staff and faculty. And so there is that tension there. And I think this would be one of those scenarios where if you're using that one-time payment process or the single-use payment process, it is an example of an imperfect solution. It can be very useful if it is a one-time payment that you don't expect to be making again. But yeah, if it is going to be routinely providing payments to the same person or group, it can be more challenging. I think the way to solve that issue really is to just work with finance about if you have this long-term relationship and like what solutions can you come up with that would work for everybody, and just have that really open, transparent conversation about that if it is going to be repeated payments to an individual over time.
Yeah, I think maybe the other just maybe does distinction that like a single-use payment is, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, is just for people external to the like non-affiliate UBC. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So single-use payment, the 250 cap is for non-affiliate UBC members. A one-time payment can be used to pay current UBC employees with an honoraria for work that's done outside of their normal job duties. So I think a one-time payment is a little bit different than a single-use payment, but similarly should be just considered for, like not ongoing work. But let's say you're asked as a, to speak on a topic that's completely unrelated to your everyday job, but you are an expert in and you present and you receive a one-time payment as a honoraria for your contributions to that work. That amount can be more than the 250, but it would streamline through your payroll rather than being provided as like a check or a cash. So I wish they just named things so differently,
I know. I'll say this too, if you are looking for single-use payment instructions, they are somewhat difficult to find. If you write in single-use payment, at least in my experience, what it does is it brings up one-time payment, which is not the process that you're looking for. So the other challenge, in addition to not necessarily understanding the language or these terms that are used that are maybe interchangeable for a lot of people and they get confused, is you look it up and you actually get pulled into guidelines that don't apply to your scenario because they're not easy to find. It's not navigable. So again, I would point to the resource that we created for community engagement. We've tried to just pull everything into one place, and it's easy to go through it and have a look at different resources. So I really encourage people to look there and see what they can use through that resource.
Absolutely. And I will say that this single-use payment has, like Ryan said, been a fairly new introduction. And I think it does solve an issue that was previously noted about providing small amounts of money for folks who, maybe don't need to provide so much information. It is a newer process than the Indigenous finance guidelines. So although it may definitely be applicable for folks who are working with Indigenous partners, that information is currently not included in the Indigenous finance guidelines and will be included in a future updated version. But if you are looking for single-use payment instructions, please check out Ryan's how-to guide at community engagement. It's a really wonderful resource.
Oh, thanks, Sam.
Great, thanks. There's a comment from Kathy in the chat as well saying that based on their experience, it appears that one-time honorarium payments to UBC staff can be paid more than once, but only once or twice a year. So just to add some context.
Thanks for that.
I'll add 2 short questions as well. Can you please direct us to links regarding payments for over $500 from Allison?
I can do that. Maybe I will, instead of searching for that now, I will provide it to all those who are registered in a follow-up email.
That's good. Thanks, Ryan. And then the next one is, do payments via check or EFT require supplier setup, from Dana?
Oh, it depends. If you're paying via that single-use payment process, the nice thing about it is that you can just make that payment. You provide the mailing address or banking details right in the request. But if you're going to pay just by check or EFT, they need to be set up as a supplier in Workday so that you can process that payment. And I would add the little caveat, it's not generally an issue, but it could be, and this is something to be mindful of, is that if you have someone set up as a supplier, they've talked to you about wanting an EFT payment, but they are set up as a check payment in Workday, that will need to be modified. So there's a process for making a change to a supplier method of payment preference that you would have to follow. And again, that's also in the community engagement guidelines. So look for detailed instructions there, but just something to be aware of. If the person would prefer EFT or check, that it's probably already set up as a supplier in the system.
Great. And there's actually one last question, and then I think we'll put a hold on any further questions. It's kind of a long one. It's from so here we go. With the spend authorization process to provide community members with cash at the time of the event, can you only do a spend authorization for one payment at a time? In other words, you cannot do a spend authorization to provide 5 different community members cash honoraria at the event. And again, Kathy helpfully responded to say that she has been able to request single spend authorization to pay multiple people at a single event. Yeah, over to you too, if you have any additional comments.
Yep. I think that you can request a spend authorization in a cash advance to pay multiple honorariums at a single event. The one caveat is that I believe per work tag, so like per, where the money's coming from, you're only allowed to have one open spend authorization at a time. So, if you request and approve for a spend authorization for 3 honoraria, and you're like, oh crap, I actually need 6 honoraria, you would have to close the spend authorization and then reopen a new one. You couldn't, or if you have 2 projects going at the same time that are coming from the same work tag, like you can't have multiple spend authorizations open at the same time. You would need to open and then close them before opening a new one.
And I just add, you can give money back to the university. So you can think strategically about your process and say, I think I'm going to give $500 to 5 different people, $100 each. And then a 6th person appears after you've already opened that spend authorization. So you can say, well, I think I'm going to have 500. It's possible I might need 6. I'm going to get a spend authorization for $600. And then when I am closing that spend authorization, I'm going to, we recompense the university that $100 to close it and say this, the additional honoraria payment wasn't used and the money is coming back to the university. So you can do those kinds of things. So it's just more thinking about like, what are my needs? What are my community partners' needs? And how do I build that into what I do on the back end?
Great example of strategic thinking.
Thanks both. That's the questions.
Okay, awesome. Wow. Well, thanks so much for those questions and for moderating the chat, Katie. Super great to have everybody ask what they need to know. So going back to the pre-workshop survey that we sent around, we did ask people what the common context they would be providing honoraria in. are, as well as what are some common barriers or obstacles that you face or have experienced when you've been providing honoraria payments. And so we amalgamated these and sort of themed them. And so yeah, this is a summary of 4 key points of key barriers that we heard from folks who completed the survey about what they experienced. And I'll let Ryan introduce the first one, and then we'll kind of go back and forth and discuss these.
Thanks, Sam. So the first one we heard, and we heard that across the board really, was that there's just sort of general system access issues. So Workday is not intuitive. It's way too elaborate. It feels like you need to have finance or accounting background in order to really use it effectively. There's a disproportionate amount of administrative work when you're offering just small honoraria payments. You have to do all this stuff and bring all this information to bear, and you're providing someone with a $50 honoraria payment. And then to make matters worse, there's a small payment you're offering, and there's delays in system processes. And then this makes UBC and staff look bad to partners. And this is a really big risk to partnerships, as I'm sure lots of people have experienced. And so in terms of these barriers, again, I think it comes back to there's an imperfect system here. We have to try to be as knowledgeable about the system and what can happen as possible, so that we can just bring that all to the surface, work with our partners to just talk about them and understand what could possibly happen, and use whatever methods of payment are available to us that are best suited to our particular scenario. So again, this familiarize yourself with Workday and with those documents that you may need to use. Figure out what you can do on your own without your partner to fill out those documents, to complete those forms, to just get them out of the way so that you don't have to worry about them, and do it as early as possible. Develop systems in your own department. So if the university's documentation is really not working for your partner in the context of your partnership, develop systems that speak the language of your partner, or use ways of communicating that work with your partner. You can have in-person conversations and then say, I'm going to follow up with you by email to just lay out what we just talked about. Just respond saying, looks good. That's enough. I have enough information to just then plug into Workday. So just making sure that you're thinking about what information you need and what's the easiest way to work with your partner to get it. And then really talk to them about timelines. Again, this comes back to there are delays. Delays happen. Sometimes they happen for reasons that are really clear. And you're like, oh, we screwed up, and this is why that delay happened. And sometimes, like I said, we were paying somebody in the US. The check just went missing. I have no idea why, even to this day. But if we talk about checks and we talk about all the things that we can do, like getting a courier service to deliver the check, we can avoid that delay. But we can still be honest about, we're using the mail system. It's known that things in the mail go missing. We have to be aware of that as a possibility because we're using that choice. If that option really, if the possibility of delaying payment is just a no-go for your partner, then maybe you need to start talking about whether EFT, or in the case of a US-based citizen, that automated clearinghouse option is in play. Or maybe if they are coming to an event where you will both be with each other, maybe cash payment is an option that you can explore together. So just thinking about whether the delays will matter and what you can do to try to avoid them as well.
Mm-hmm. And, I think that this system access issue and burden of administrative work, delays in the system, I see these as all being part of our responsibility as being equitable and good partners to community members to take that on, right? That this is the system that we have, and it's kind of our burden to deal with it for them in a way that, meets their needs. And it sucks, right? It sucks. It's not a fun thing to have to do, as researchers, as, maybe as educators, as organizers. We're not always trained or feel good about taking on administrative labor. Maybe it's not in our regular wheelhouse, but You know, it's something that we have to do. And I think that speaks to those values that Ryan was really grounding us all in to begin this day. So a next big barrier that we heard from folks was this idea of SIN requirement, where partners regularly question why we need SINs, and they don't want to provide it to a stranger. There's lack of clarity around requirements to situations involving Indigenous recipients in particular, specifically around T4As and SIN requests. So you know, first of all, I just want to say that this is a really clear example of one of those situations where there is just a huge discrepancy between what the university expects in terms of their compliance obligations and what community partners expect in terms of what's culturally appropriate. You know, in many situations, it's inappropriate to ask a community member, particularly Indigenous people, for SIN. It is reminiscent of colonialism. It certainly does not respect Indigenous ways of doing things, such as gifting or reciprocity that use financial tokens of appreciation. You know, all those things can really act as barriers to good partnership practices. You know, that is a very unfortunate discrepancy between what the university is expected to do for the CRA. So I will say though that, and this is the really relieving part, right, is that the only thing that UBC is required to do for the CRA is to request a SIN. There's no obligation for any community partner to provide their SIN in order to receive an honoraria. You just have to request it. And that request can be documented in different ways, whether that's like Ryan described, where you're, you know, discussing with a community partner about providing honoraria, and you say, hey, you know, UBC has to have me ask for SIN, you know, are you willing to provide it? You're under no obligation to say yes. And then they can say, I don't really want to, or I don't trust you, or no, I don't want to. And then you're like, great, absolutely not. I've done my due diligence. UBC has done their due diligence. This can proceed, no problem. And this is where also the cultural honoraria, cultural advising and honoraria forms, or honoraria forms more broadly, can also play a really important role. In all of these forms, baked into the form is a question that says, are you willing to provide your SIN to UBC, yes or no? And community partners can just cross off the no box, and that's totally cool. You know, community partners are actually, you don't have to disclose a whole lot of personal information at all. But SIN numbers in particular, they can be a very tenuous one. So when you're providing honoraria, you can document an unwillingness to provide a SIN through the cultural advising and honoraria form. And if you are unable to ask that person to then sign that form and witness the transaction of honoraria, you can also have a witness sign that form and provide that as documentation to Workday. Ryan, did you have any other thoughts about SIN?
No, I think just for me, it all comes down to also having a clear rationale. I mean, as the insider within UBC, you need to be thinking about, what am I going to document and how? Not what is my community partner going to document? How am I going to rationalize the decision that's been made, which is a reasonable decision, to UBC, so that UBC can say, we have done our work to remain in compliance with the rules that govern how we behave as an institution, and how can you provide them with that information so that they feel comfortable with moving ahead. So those emails, those forms, whatever it is that you can provide, that you can create and then use as documentation within the Workday system, will be a great help to you going forward and help to avoid those delays. Okay, so we will just move on to excessive paperwork, which I know is rubs a lot of people the wrong way. So a main one, there's sort of two sides to this coin. The first is that partners are asked to complete forms, and you're really offering a small amount of money, and you're asking them to do a lot of labor in order to complete these forms. And in some cases, offering a gift card is much simpler, because you can just give it to them, and then you will do a reimbursement on that expense after the fact, and it's a very simple process. They don't have to get too involved. That may make the most sense in your case. So if that is the thing that you need to do in order to keep your partnership going, this is the way that it should be for you, that's great. That's okay. That's not a problem. So when they are going to have to complete forms, when they want that payment by EFT, for example, or they want that payment by check and you need to complete information, the question that you can ask yourself, and this kind of gets to the other side of it, is how much paperwork do you need to do? Is that being a good partner sometimes means you take on that burden, or in most cases means you take on that burden. They're providing you with their time, and a way of honoring that time is taking on that work for them and not asking them to do excessive paperwork. They may need to go to the bank to set up an EFT that you can't do for them. Unfortunately, that's just how the system at UBC works. So that may be something you need to ask of them. However, you can have a conversation about not doing EFT if that is just too much of a burden on them to go to the bank. Maybe they don't have easy access to banking. Maybe checked isn't even appropriate because they don't have a regular mailing address that they can provide to you. There could be all sorts of scenarios that come up that just don't make those options available, and you can reduce the paperwork and burden on them to be able to make use of those options. The other issue is for staff is that the process to set up a supplier on Workday takes time and multiple forms are needed. I'm really sorry. There's nothing I can do to change Workday and what it is. There are some cases where an honorarium payment is going to require you to set up a supplier, and it's just something you're going to have to do. The one piece of advice that I can give about this, and it's one that I've done myself, is I'm so familiar with setting up a supplier now I could do it with my eyes closed. It's very simple once you've done it a number of times, and it's very easy to learn when you're doing it without the pressure of having to get an honorarium payment out the door. So just get in there and play and see what it looks like. You'll find all these little shortcuts that you can use. That search bar at the top, the instructions don't use that search bar enough. That search bar is so useful. So use it to find the parts of the process, and it'll help make things just a little bit smoother and less aggravating, because I do empathize with everybody. I understand just how frustrating that system is.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a frustrating system. It's the one that we're stuck with. And so I think, again, it speaks back to those values of like, you know, sometimes we got to do things we don't like to be good partners. And that's just the lived reality, unfortunately. So the final barrier that we heard from folks kind of speaks to a few of these other points that we've already touched on briefly, and that's personal information disclosure that does require that there's a belief there's a barrier that people feel that requiring there's a barrier that people feel that collecting a fair amount of personal information and a lot of administrative burden, all for a smaller one-time payment, and general requirement to disclose personal details is not always appropriate. All the work to fill a deposit form, etc. Okay, so speaking to the first parts again, recipients are not required to provide high levels of personal detail to UBC. So, particularly when it comes to providing cash or near cash equivalents, in order to show receipt that happened, having a name, an address is helpful, or at least a general area, and then a signature by either the participant or the recipient or a witness is, generally enough for a small honoraria. But again, that decision to not provide their personal information is helpful to document, because then you can show UBC that you met their requirements around requesting the information, and that the recipient was unwilling to provide it. Of course, if you are trying to if someone wants to receive a check or something in the mail, check in the mail or an EFT, disclosure of personal information is just what they'd have to do, and you'd have to go through collecting that if that's the kind of payment that they would like to receive. And then some people might not have the required, they might not have as much personal information to disclose. Let's say someone has a moving or non-fixed address, or maybe their street involved and they don't have a fixed address. So in that situation, there is no like the requirement is null and void. So I think that it's important to remember that personal information, you know, is necessary for certain payments, is inappropriate in some situations, or unavailable in other situations.
I
oh,
also
sorry.
want.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Sam.
Oh,
I
that's
also
okay.
I just saw Craig posted a comment that linked to another barrier that isn't included here, and we didn't include it here because it's more of a systemic barrier that we can't do anything about, but we're aware of, and very interested to try to work towards change in this area, which is decentralization of UBC leads to a lot of different processes, different rules, different blockages for people providing honoraria based on which faculty they're working for or portfolio they're working for and how they engage with these processes. This is really sort of baked into how UBC works. I always think of it as like a bunch of fiefdoms that all kind of have their own kingdoms and they work their own way. And so it would be great as sort of a next stage of this work. What we've done so far, both through the Indigenous finance guidelines and now the CE guidelines that we've created, is really just a translation exercise of existing systems. We haven't changed anything. We've just said, this is an easier way to understand it, and we're trying to lay it out all in one place for people to be able to use more easily. But what are those blockages that are more systemic that need to be transformed? And those will take time. And those are the types of barriers that you're going to hit. And you're going to have to try and find creative solutions around them, which we did hear about in the survey. So working with finance and HR and colleagues in your office about ways that they've navigated those systems, and then trying to create your own internal processes as much as you can to figure out those little gaps in the system. Because there are, while UBC is set up to pay honoraria, unfortunately, the way the institution is organized, it does create the need for workarounds in some areas. And so you will have to kind of understand how each faculty or portfolio works in order to figure out what to do in that particular scenario.
That's great. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, some things we just don't have answers to, right? Some things that just will require ongoing system improvement, highlighting these, you know, impossibilities are important for your finance team to escalate, and hopefully Workday will continue to change in order to meet these requirements in the future, for sure. I just wanted to speak one more thing about the SIN requirements and personal information disclosures. If someone is unwilling to provide personal information to the university, when you're entering this information into Workday, you're able to use what would be referred to as like a dummy SIN, which would just be 9 zeros. So if someone is unwilling to provide information to you, using dummy SINs or dummy information is a suitable insert in those areas.
And I suppose at this point too, would be it's also in the resources. It's both in the Indigenous guidelines as well as the CE guidelines. When you're using cash or near cash equivalents, the accounts payable team created a manual T4A process. It's a portal where you can submit information related to a cash payment, for example, and that's where you would put in a SIN. And in that scenario, when you don't have a SIN, that's when you would put in that dummy SIN.
That's right. Thank you, Ryan.
Which again is in all the instructions that you can find in those two resources, but just to say it here for people's information. I see questions again in the chat. Should we maybe take a pause here just to reflect on those, because we only have about 15 minutes left here. So.
Let's do that. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We have a few questions specific to Sam, your comment around not requiring the SIN. So the first is from Kate. Sam, when you mentioned there's no requirement for any community member to provide a SIN number, is that just Indigenous partners or non-Indigenous partners as well?
Oh, I would imagine that would be for any partner. I think the university's obligation is to request the SIN, and that it is, if a participant or recipient is unwilling to provide that information, then the university has done its due diligence to CRA requirements. Ryan, would that be your imagination as well?
That's my understanding. But again, I would just really emphasize the need to have a clear rationale as to why that is happening. It can't just be, we didn't collect it. It can't
Yeah.
look like that. Like it has to be. There's a reason why this SIN is not appropriate in this situation, and that can be for all sorts of different reasons. It's just being mindful of having that in mind as you're going through the process. If the person says no, I'm not providing it, and be like, now can I clearly rationalize that inside the institution, and then working with finance teams to talk about that. And if there is conflict there about, okay, does that rationality or does that rationalization make any sense for the institution, then maybe there needs to be more of a strategic conversation about what to do going forward about that type of scenario, because you can't force somebody to provide information. It could be that at that point, the institution won't let me provide you with a check payment or a cash payment because they for whatever reason won't accept that you're not providing a SIN. Maybe the gift card becomes your option in that particular scenario, but maybe going forward you can find another solution to that problem if that rationale that you provided is really airtight and should be acknowledged and respected. So it's about, are you going to be the advocate for your community partner in this scenario? Because they have no voice here inside the institution. It's, you have to bring their concerns to bear and try to make the institution hear it.
Thank you. Kat asks, further to Kate's question, she wants to double check. Can we put in writing, quote, are you willing to provide UBC with your SIN, question mark, you are not obligated to, end quote.
That is very specific language for me personally to approve. I, okay, so SINs are complicated, right? Because the other challenging thing is that the university just uses SINs as one form of tracking. If this person has provided their SIN in other contexts to the university will like link that information and still like come up with a T4 if the total payments in one annual basis is more than $500. In terms of this specific question, you are not obligated to. Are you willing to provide UBC with your SIN? It's hard because UBC wants to collect this information, right? I make it clear for everyone here that people aren't required to provide it, but UBC would like to provide it. It's preferential for them to have access to it so that they can, provide some with a T4A at the end of the year if they end up getting a few honoraria payments or an honoraria payment that is, taxable. So it's so maybe it's not in writing, maybe it's not just a statement like that, but maybe it's context in a conversation where you're talking about honoraria payments with your community partner. You discuss that UBC has obligations to the CRA, and that one of them is to request a SIN number. Are you willing to provide it to UBC, question mark? And then they can say yes or no, and then so maybe I'm having to kind of toe a line here where like I understand what the university wants us to do, which is to collect SIN while also trying to create a situation where community partners have a voice and say in it as well. And it is a fine line that we all have to walk as university employees, faculty and students. So I'm not sure. Ryan, what do you think of that, about that specific language? Because it's true, right? They're not obligated to. So are you telling a lie when you say that? No, but is that maybe the rationale that you want to create for the university? It might what that might end up doing is that might end up finance might learn that people are, they might then end up saying that's not an appropriate response, is what I would worry about.
That I think going back to the initial discussions that we had about values, and we're talking about relationality and connectedness, and that you own a two-way relationship, one to your partner and one to UBC. If there is an appearance that you are pushing your partner to not provide a SIN, that's going to be a problem. And it's going to be a problem for you and your partner, not just for finance, because it's going to cause delays. So it has to be what I would call an honest attempt to obtain that SIN. There has to be some effort to say, this is the process I have to go through. I need your SIN. If you are unwilling to provide that SIN, you do not have to provide it. But like getting someone to say, I hear you, I don't have to provide it, so I'm just not going to, I think would be received on the other end as disingenuous. And so you want to try to avoid that, right? You are maintaining a strong bond and relationship with both sides. You are that spanner. You're not one-sided or the other. So trying to have as much integrity in maintaining those relationships would be really paramount and important in the relationships that you have.
Yeah, totally agree with that perspective, Ryan. I think that, an honest attempt at obtaining SIN, within culturally appropriate bounds, would be best for maintaining that positive relationship with, both being inside a university as well as being a bridge to your community partners. So, yeah, that's great.
Great, thank you both. There was also a question for the group. How are others collecting SIN numbers and personal information in a way that is compliant with UBC's privacy requirements? Both Eliza and Heather offered some very helpful approaches. So I encourage you all to read those in the chat. And it also ties into a comment from, I think it was from Tio, assuming there's interest, would workshop attendees be invited to share your processes, unit or department created tools that help navigate these financial processes and would be useful for others. So I suppose there's an invite there for us to consider how to keep people connected and sharing resources. Do you have any thoughts or comments, Ryan and Sam?
For the CE resource that we've created, I'd really love for that to, in addition to the tools and resources that we've created, become like a repository for others to add theirs. So if you have other forms that you use, or you have processes that you're reading through those resources, being like, there's something else you could do here, there's another additional piece, those are an organic resource that we can all build onto. I've relied on lots of other people. I had a great advisory group for that process. I also had the Community Engagement Network, and Kat is here as the leader of the engagement network. And they provided resources that I've borrowed from. So I didn't create anything on my own. I just took from what other people have already developed and put it all together. And I very much love to grow that resource so that we all have this opportunity. And it also makes me mindful that a lot of this, because it is relationality as a core to all of this, it's not just with HR and finance reps in your own offices, it's with each other. You all have your own ways of doing this. You have your methods that have become really useful, approaches to engagement and how they link in with paying honoraria. I would love to create a forum of some kind for us to all bring those to bear more often, so that we're working together as opposed to apart.
Excellent. There's some really important questions here as well that I want to save some time for. I'm going to kind of push them together. I hope you don't mind. One is from Sam. He asks, so then what is the best process if you want to pay an Indigenous partner with no mailing address and who's uncomfortable with providing a SIN? And then Sophie's is the second one. If someone refuses to provide a SIN and receives more than $500 annually, are they then obligated to report it as income when they do their taxes?
So to answer Sam's question, I think that in that situation, providing someone with cash would be both appropriate for the context that you laid out, as well as culturally appropriate as well. So completing a spend authorization, getting approval from which would get approval from your unit manager, and then requesting the cash advance, pulling out the cash and providing it in person would probably be the best process. You would then have a receipt or some kind of witness statement saying that, this transaction happened, and you'd reconcile the spend authorization using the additional paperwork and forms, the HR fast track form, as well as some kind of communication about how much you were going to provide that person. In terms of Sophie's question, short answer, if someone is receiving $500, I'm not a tax expert, but my understanding is that yes, financial gifts from the university are considered taxable income, and that over $500 would be sort of the threshold for reporting. At least from the university's perspective, more than $500 would be the threshold for them to produce a T4A. I wouldn't want to give anybody advice about what they would have to do personally, because I'm not a tax expert.
Liza does offer some experience in that situation. She says, if paid directly to the recipient via EFT or check, my understanding is that a T4A is automatically generated and sent to the address of the payee. It's now up to them to declare their earnings.
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Eliza. That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. And then there's one more question, which is about gift cards. Could you please clarify what is the proper documentation when offering gift cards? Based on my experience, when reconciling gift card purchases, the gift recipients still need to be clearly identified, name, address, etc. Thank you. From Ludmila.
Yeah, that would be my understanding as well, that you would reconcile that expense in Workday, and then as part of your documentation, you would say honoraria were provided to, however many people it was. Let's say it was just one in this case, and this is their name. And while you're providing the gift card, you would again make that request for the information that you're required to provide. But again, that person's under no obligation to provide you with personal information. So I think Sam and I have discussed this ad nauseum, that really at the end of the day, when you're coming to these very simple payment options, the name is the thing that somebody is really kind of obligated to give you in some respects. But even in those cases, it may be difficult to get a name. So you're just trying to do the best you can to provide documentation for that expense. And if there is a very good rationale as to why you were not able to provide that information, I can imagine a scenario where there's lots of different volunteers that are receiving gift cards for their work at an event or something like that, and there's a good reason why you're not able to get their name, whatever that may be. If you can rationalize that within the documentation, and you're going to rely on your friends in finance to accept your rationalization. So just keep that in mind. You're building these relationships in these two different ways. If it means getting a name from somebody that you've given a gift card and just making that your obligation, I just need to get a name so that I can write it down and have it in my documentation, then you have to put the effort into trying to get that done. Your finance people may say, hey, I also want a mailing address. I want to be able to identify these people who are getting gift cards. And you just sort of have to do your level best to make that happen.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot there was one final question, and Ryan had started to answer it. It's from Kat. Do you know of any advocacy efforts to improve our systems?
Yeah, so I offered 3 there. I'll open the floor to Sam and anybody else in the room who's heard of others, but those are 3 that just sort of popped into my mind, as well as the creation of the community engagement guidelines. I should have added those as a 4th, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I know that the finance folks, they know that things are not perfect for providing these sorts of payments, particularly when it starts to involve people who are affiliated with the university. That's a particularly complicated issue that I think are people still working out. So I know that there are conversations happening around trying to make the system better. I think that, yeah, definitely the creation of the Indigenous Finance Guidelines, like I said, like we're looking to create a version 2.0, which hopefully will continue to push some of these issues forward. So yeah, you know, there's hope on the horizon, perhaps. Uh-huh. It is 11:30 now, so that does bring us to the end of our time here with you today, talking about providing honorary payments to your community partners. Hopefully, we've demystified some of this a little bit and given you some strategies, tools, ideas, values to continue to drive your work forward, to, you know, build your confidence in knowing what you have to do, how you can do it, how you should do it, to be the best equitable partner that you can be. So, you know, thank you all so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I just echo everything that Sam has said. My voice is starting to go on me, as I'm sure you can probably hear. So I'll keep it short. Thank you all for joining us, and I really, really hope that this is helpful and it starts you down a good path for making the system work for you and your partners.
Mm-hmm.